for joining. Thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is Sabina Devan, and I'm the President and Executive Director of the JustJobs Network, which is a think tank, a global think tank that focuses on issues related to labor markets, strategies for employment generation, and workforce development. Of course, a very integral part of the job story is the way that technology is upending the way that we all live and work, and specifically how work is changing as a result of platforms and work mediated through platforms. Today, we're going to have a conversation with three renowned experts in this area, and specifically what we're interested in looking at is how women engage with this ecosystem of digital work. This conversation is part of a portfolio of projects funded by the International Development Research Center, where different organizations have come together to look at different aspects of platformization and the effect on women's work, and digitalization and the effect on women's work. This consortium is called the Women Work and Gig Economy Collaborative. And it aims to study how digital platforms can enhance specifically women's economic empowerment and build more gender-inclusive labor markets in the global South. Through this initiative, we have researchers in 7 countries across the global South and Southeast Asia that are trying to understand the challenges and the opportunities that women face in accessing and benefiting from platform-mediated work. And the consortium jointly provides evidence-based recommendations to policymakers and platform managers, on practices and scalable solutions as this sort of trend of digitalization unfolds. So for today's session, it is my honor to introduce 3 panelists. Dr. Nguyen Thanh, who is the first Vice Chairman of the Socioeconomic Policy Council in Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Thanh, it's lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kringsak Tirakowidkajan, I hope I've said it correctly, who's the Managing Director of, at the Just Economy and Labor Institute in Thailand, and Dr. Aisha Zainuddin, who's Senior Research Manager at Learn Asia in Sri Lanka. So thank you all for joining us. Today's session is both recorded as well as being live streamed. So just for our viewers to know that. And please feel free as we proceed with the conversation to enter any questions that you might have in the chat box. So this will be a short 1-hour session. So our hope is to just, get straight into it. And Dr. Thanh, if I could start with you. Over the last several years, even before the pandemic, Vietnam saw both high levels of economic growth, as well as gains in its human development. Can you start by just laying the land for us and telling us a little bit about the role that technology has played in these levels of economic growth and human development? And particularly when you look at the overall technological landscape in Vietnam, do women have equitable access? Where does this issue, how does this issue play out in Vietnam relative to some of its neighboring countries? Dr. Thanh, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabina. Yes, indeed. During the past 5 years, Vietnamese economy did quite well. So in the period from 2016 to 2020, the average GDP growth rate was 5.9%, which is quite good because it also included 2020 when the economy was hit hard by the pandemic, and of which Vietnam total factor productivity contributed roughly 45% to the national growth rate, exceeding the target set by the National Assembly of between 30 and 35%. And TIP growth, you should know that is largely driven by improvements in technological capabilities and their application. And there are also other indicators, such as the proportion of employees working in the high-tech manufacturing industry. It increased steadily over the past decade from 2% in 2010 to 5.4% in 2018. And the proportion of workers in the knowledge-intensive service industry also experienced a significant increase from 1.1% to 1.9% between 2010 and 2018. And in the WIPO Global Innovation Index, Vietnam is ranked 44th out of 132 countries. And in another quite useful index, that is Global Skill Index, Vietnam ranked Vietnamese technological skills is ranked second in Asia Pacific and 22nd globally among 60 countries surveyed. So these are quite good, and those impressive achievements are still fall short of what is required given Vietnam's very ambitious development goals. And there are a number of issues that I would like to discuss here. The first one is technological development is largely driven by FDI, notably multinational corporations leading global value chains that have increasing presence in Vietnam. But at the same time, the linkages between FDIs and domestic firms are still weak. Second, R&D expenditure are still low, roughly 0.4% of GDP, as compared to 2.1% of GDP in China and 1.3% of GDP in Malaysia. Meanwhile, Vietnam is aiming high to become an upper middle income country by 2025 and high income country by 2045, when it celebrates 100th anniversary of independence. And as the population is aging, this requires that labor productivity growth. We need to accelerate to 6.46% per year over the next 3 decades, which is much higher than 5.3% annually between 2012 and 2018, the highest in the 3 decades. So now I would like to move on to the second part of the seminar questions, that is the gender inequality in accessing and employing technology. First, I would like to say that up until now, men still dominate scientific and technological activities. But the good news is that the girls' education in Vietnam has improved markedly, significantly in recent years, with the country scoring relatively well on the World Bank gender parity indexes for primary, secondary, and higher education. But I think that to leverage this momentum, there is a need to create pathways in getting more women into STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, by both enabling broad access to technology and participating in its creation. Companies in STEM fields can invest in and partner with a number of organizations, including colleges, to develop a broader pool of women going into tech fields. Furthermore, more can be done to address the funding gap faced by women tech entrepreneurs as part of the broad effort to encourage women to create technology and work in new ways. Measures can include eliminating biases in recruitment and selection processes by incubators and accelerators, and introducing special funding pools that focus on women-owned enterprises. There are also many targeted solutions that should support women, but because of time constraint, I think that I will stop here. Thank you, Sabina.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tang. A couple of follow-ups. The accomplishments that Vietnam has made in the years preceding the pandemic, have been very impressive by any standard. But now, as you mentioned, there's these looming challenges of an aging population and the need for double-digit growth to realize the very ambitious agenda that the government has laid out. What role do platforms play in this? How much of the thrust of digitalization in Vietnam is driven by platformization of the economy? To what extent is Vietnam relying on services that rely on platforms? And once again, coming back to the question of women, what are some of the implications of women's engagement with this range of platformized work or gig work in Vietnam?
Yes, to give you a background on this question, I would like to say that now there are roughly 72 million internet users in Vietnam, or approximately 74% of the population have access to the internet. And social media has been becoming increasingly popular in Vietnam, with roughly 70% million social media users in Vietnam. For example, Facebook and YouTube are very, very popular in Vietnam. And the good news is that women are more and more active on social media. At the start of 2022, roughly 1 in 2 Facebook users were female. So roughly equal, the gender equality here in terms of participation in the social media. With regard to the landscape on the gig economy, first, I would like to say that according to a study by the Ministry of Science and Technology, Vietnam digital economy was worth roughly $3 billion in 2015, but it increased to $9 billion in 2018, and it's anticipated to hit $30 billion in 2025. So almost 10 times within 10 years. And e-commerce has been increasingly very rapidly at around 30% per year. Its revenue was around $8 billion in 2018 and reached at least $10 billion in 2020. So it's quite impressive growth. The online advertising market is quickly expanding, with revenue reaching over $1 billion in 2020, 3 times greater than in 2016. And as the COVID-19 pandemic fades away and production and commercial activities under the new normal condition emerge, the digitalization of numerous services and commerce and manufacturing activities in Vietnam accelerate. So we expect that this year, the platform economy will grow quite impressively. So in terms of participation of workers in general and female workers in particular in the platform economy, I would like to give you a few figures. That in 2020, Vietnam had 27 million informal employees, accounting for 53% of the overall workforce. So you see that the non-farm informal employment is quite prevalent in Vietnam, and so and roughly 30% of these informal workers are, in absolute term, over 8 million workers working in the gig economy. So this is from the General Statistical Office, which produced a report recently. So in Vietnam, gig workers have diverse occupations such as technology driver, delivery workers, domestic workers, online sales staff, freelancer, programmer, YouTuber, blogger, product reviewers, and online survey takers. And the good news is for inclusive growth in Vietnam is that the gig economic model is spreading quite rapidly across all provinces, cities, and regions in Vietnam. And because of the recent impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the implementation of mobility restriction and difficulties faced by manufacturing businesses in the new conditions, the number of freelance workers participating in transportation and supply services, such as taxi driver and shippers, also increasing, thanks to apps such as Grab, Gojek, Lavamo, and a number of other, Vietnamese and international apps. But at the same time, I would like to say that as the digital economy grows, Vietnam faces various challenges, including cybersecurity and pressures of competitiveness of the integration process. With regard to gender, women participation in those platform economy, I think that women are actually participate very, very actively in e-commerce. There are quite many cases of women who work on the platforms, e-commerce platform from mountainous areas that their activities actually create quite a lot of opportunities for other people in remote areas, given the fact that in Vietnam, connective infrastructure and logistics also grow very rapidly. So now I think that in terms of getting more women to participate in and benefit from the gig economy, the women union should be more progressive in raising awareness among women about the advantages and disadvantages of the gig economy. And another point I would like to make is that the burden of unpaid care and domestic work currently falls disproportionately on the shoulders of women. Based on the data of labor force survey, one of our studies found that women spend 8.4 hours per week on unpaid care and domestic work, more than men do, controlling for numerous individual characteristics such as educational level, age, ethnicity, location, industry, and profession. And so to enable women to participate more in the economy in general and in the gig economy in particular, I think that we should have some interventions towards reducing gender inequality regarding unpaid care and domestic work. For example, Vietnam should think about increasing public investment in infrastructures that can disproportionately benefit women, such as the supply of clean water, nursery, and kindergarten. And it's also very important to change social norms that are still biased against women regarding unpaid care and domestic work. In our recent survey, we found that approximately 7 in 10 respondents think that unpaid care and domestic work is primarily women's responsibility. So I think that there should be awareness campaigns that change that should work towards changing this social norm and towards a kind of better sharing of unpaid care work. So in short, that the gig economy is growing quite fast, and is and in Vietnam, we now policymakers talk a lot about digital transformation in general and also a gig economy in particular, and we are aware of both advantages and disadvantages of gig economy, and we know both benefits and also challenges that the process of digital transformation in Vietnam is facing. For example, people are worried about cybersecurity, privacy, and there is increasingly people talk about the digital divide between different ethnic groups, different regions, and between men and women. So I think that we need to have in place policy and regulation that maximize the benefits and minimize the costs and the risk. So this is what I would like to say. Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. The Vietnamese experience is really set up, I think, from a very macro picture of economic trends and digitalization to really raising some of the issues as this trend of platformization unfolds and the impact that it has on women's work. You talked a lot about the disproportionate burden of domestic work that falls to women. Kringsak, I would like to come to you next to understand the Thai experience in terms of women that are using platforms to engage as domestic workers. So it's not, on the one hand, we've got this issue of women microtasking or freelancing at home and or engaging in e-commerce from home, these kinds of home-based work. But it's also, I want to first explore with you your research on specifically women as domestic workers or as massage therapists in Thailand. So if you could tell us, how is work mediated through platforms different from this kind of work, domestic work and massage therapists? How is the work online different from this kind of work offline?
Thank you, Sabina, for the question. And thank you, Dr. Tang, for setting up the really important context. I think the context of women's unpaid care work at home really applies in general to a lot of women, as Dr. Tang said, around the world. I think for me, it is important to start by acknowledging that the two types of care work, we categorize the two occupations that we study as care work are not only gendered, the sense that, a lot of women are in this sector, but they are really undervalued because of the reason that Dr. Tang has explained. And also important to say that in Thailand, as elsewhere, domestic work is looked down upon as manual work, and most workers are from low-income communities, and a lot of them are migrant workers. By contrast, the personal care work, such as massage therapy, is often perceived to be associated with sex work due to several reasons. So women in the massage industry often face stigma, and they want to disassociate their professional work from that perception. And I think we could say that for all of these reasons, domestic and massage work are generally, the workers are underpaid, and they are, the conditions of their work are actually, they work beyond the job descriptions. Oftentimes they don't have a job description at all. They're in a so-called informal economy where they don't get to see the contract or understand the terms of work. And they're largely excluded from the legal protections. So this is the general context for the care work or the gig work. But I think important question is, how does online and digital platform change all of this? I think we need to start with the commonality, and what doesn't change. What doesn't change is that this care work is largely and always location-based, in the sense that the services require co-presence of the service provider or workers and the customers or the service recipients. And they're interactive work in the sense that they interact with each other. The work is really embodied or and use body. For example, in the case of massage work, that involves workers' body as part of the work. Although this characteristic is not changed by platform, the nature of care work is complicated by the advent of labor platforms. And I would like to use the term labor platform to talk about this online or digital platforms in general, because in our research, I think our argument, we agree with a lot of researchers and scholars who argue that these platforms actually act as a labor broker or labor brokerage, and we call them labor platforms. If we, to answer your question, if we take the offline care work or gig work as a reference, I think there are several implications for the changing nature of work in the with regard to the platform-based care work, and I will limit only to 3 aspects: the meaning of work, how the service is performed, and its formality. First of all, I think in practice, with the mediation of digital and online platforms, the meaning of work is changing. It is extended to cover more than the task being performed. And I'm talking about cleaning and massaging. But the work right now covers, most importantly, getting from where the workers are to the destination or locations of the customers, right? And waiting is, waiting for next task is also a major element of the work, as we can see apparently in the case of food delivery or transport workers, which are easily seen because often and most of the time the services are performed in the public space. But for the domestic workers and massage therapists, because the work that they are performed are in the private space, mostly in someone's apartment, that is more complicated, and it exposed the workers to even more threats in terms of gender-based violence. In terms of the work that are now could be considered work, there is also time that workers spend logging in, staying online, standby for the on-demand platforms to show, to distribute or allocate the gigs, or to wait for the demands for customers, and also a lot of emotional work. Secondly, the second point is how the work is performed. I think digital platforms control how the work is performed by working much more than traditional intermediaries. As the gig work has become formal in the sense that customers are told to expect standardized services and more professional services, there is a high degree of control over how the task is performed. And you can, and in the case of on-demand platforms, it means that the terms and conditions of the task are also predetermined and not negotiated between workers and the labor broker, right? Because the platforms already have pre-specified conditions that they advertise or market to customers. So customers have a set of what they should expect. In practice, platforms keep a close watch on workers' labor process by requiring workers to, updating what they're doing at each step on on-demand platforms. And this is happening mostly on on-demand platforms. Even on online-based work, it's more loosely, controlled, right? And workers still have some leeway in terms of what they want, how they want to go about their work. But you talk to domestic cleaners, they will tell you that the platforms give you orientation and trainings and tell you how you should do your work. And we went to participate in one orientation, and the platforms trainer told actually domestic workers how to start to clean the house, where to start, and how to do the work. And then she actually told the workers that customers are the most important person, and they have to do whatever customer wants. One example is to tell domestic workers to use their hand, if possible, to clean the toilet bowl, which is for me really interesting example of how platforms go at length to satisfy the customers in the climate, in this climate of tight competition. And the last point that I want to say, but briefly, because I'm going out of actually beyond my time, is the formality of the work. I think platform-based work is largely informal, right? It's still in the informal employment arrangement, but contradictory, this is work that is performed and under the supervision of formal companies or platforms. So we have seen this when we actually did the research with food delivery workers. We use the term gig economy and platform economy interchangeably, but when we started doing the research with care workers, we realized that we cannot do that anymore. First of all, because gig economy predates platform, but because the way the impact of the platform on the work itself are different, right? In the food delivery work, you know, the platform changed the work from being formal to informal. But with the domestic and massage work, the work is always and still be informal. And it's interesting that we are now seeing hybridization, you know, or a combination of non-standard employment and formalization of the services. And this is the key issue that I think a lot of researchers are grappling with, and to understand how the impacts are. Thank you. I think I'll end this here for this first question.
Thank you so much, Kringsak. That's very interesting. I mean, and you know, you raise some very important points, which you know, part of it is sort of the changing nature of work, and you gave us the example of the meaning of work and what work entails. So this idea of having to wait, and some of the new emerging forms of work are all ways in which the, you know, the traditional notions of an employer-employee relationship, or what we consider to be on-location work, all of that is changing, and some of that requires new regulations, and regulations that are unprecedented. There's no experience in how to regulate these new standard or new unstandard forms of work that are becoming the norm, right? And so that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is also, I think, what Dr. Tang was talking about, which is a policy agenda that, you know, that on-location gig work also requires an ancillary set of policies that make it easier for women to engage in income generation activities, whether that's childcare or other forms of safety, redressal mechanisms, all of those. And that's true as much of online spaces as they are of offline spaces. So, you know, after all these years of advocacy for equal rights and so on, we still struggle to get some of the most basic amenities that women need in order to be able to engage in income generation activities. So, you know, that's to everyone on this webinar that continues to fight the good fight, right? So turning to Aisha, who, you know, going a little bit west here towards Sri Lanka. And Aisha, in your research, you've examined emerging patterns of digital work and women's engagement in Sri Lanka and India. And in India, for example, we know that the women's labor force participation rate has been falling, and it is now, you know, less than 1 in 5 women, so less than 20% of women 15 plus actually participate in the labor market, and this rate has been coming down. And you know, in South Asia in general has very low rates of female labor force participation. How does the emergence of gig work and all of the issues that were raised by you know, by Dr. Tang and Dr. Kringsak, how do these issues relate to the experience of women in Sri Lanka and India in your research, and how do they interact? Is this kind of work an opportunity to improve female labor force participation rates in South Asia?
Thank you, Sabina. It's great to be here. So as you rightly point out, women's labor force participation in South Asia is pretty low. And even Sri Lanka, we have 31% female labor force participation of 31%. And across many of these countries, it's been declining over the recent years. And I mean, if you look at the two of the sort of, I wouldn't say only, but key reasons for on the supply side for this, you know, it's a lot to do with women. I mean, as the other panelists have pointed out repeatedly, it's about women bearing the larger share of care responsibilities in the family, and, you know, mobility issues, and, you know, sort of underlying all of this are a whole load of sort of cultural, socio-cultural norms and things like that. So, I mean, gig work, yes, offers, and I appreciate the broadening of sort of not just focusing on gig work, but talking about it in the larger, platform work, digitally enabled work, to sort of widen the coverage of the scope here. It, yes, in theory, offers a lot of women potential to work in remote and flexible ways. Sandwich work in between care responsibilities, and a lot of all great things, as long as you're connected in terms of device and data. You have the skills to navigate some of these platforms, or even just logistics platforms, or even just a social media business page. And you, of course, have the skills of your chosen trade, right? But the reality is not so simple. We have gender gaps in, I would say less so now in connectivity, but more so in digital skills. There's a lot, a long way to go in digital skills. There are gender gaps, specifically in India. We've seen, for instance, we've asked in surveys about a whole bunch of skills, things that people can do online, ranging from basic information search up to, creating login details and passwords for, various internet services, to doing payments online. And like, for instance, in India, I think it was 69% of men online can say set up an account and login details and passwords, whereas that number was 59% for women. So there's going to be a lot of women relying on men to help them set up, say, accounts on platforms and things like that. So the skills barriers. And then, of course, the question of, do women have the time to, in between all these care responsibilities, do they have the time to sort of navigate, and not just navigate, a lot of work on platforms requires you to be constantly, constantly upskilling, but also to spend a lot of time on digital marketing for you to sort of really be successful. And of course, flexibility. What is flexibility? It means a whole bunch of things to different people, but we know at the base, it comes at a cost, sometimes health, mental well-being and such. What we've seen in our research over the past 2 years in Sri Lanka and India to an extent is platform work, platform mediated and enabled work has provided opportunities for people to, say, find alternative sources of income when they lost a job. For instance, in Sri Lanka, the tourism, I mean, in many countries, the hospitality industries sort of came to a halt. So, we've seen women moving into home baking, into ride sharing, and stuff like that. Both using dedicated platforms, like in Sri Lanka, we have Pick Me Foods and Uber Eats, but also through social media and making use of other logistics platforms. And in Sri Lanka also, we've the platforms told us that there's been an increase in the number of women who've registered to do deliveries and stuff like that. So there's been opportunities to sort of find other ways of earning, but also to continue existing sort of earning avenues. For instance, teachers. We have a huge private tuition industry in Sri Lanka, and in fact, they were sort of very quick to adapt. And while the government and the formal school system was sort of grappling and trying to figure out how to, when schools shut, how to sort of get back to things and get classes going. We had a lot of private tuition teachers, and we know this is a female-dominated industry, quickly getting together classes on Zoom and WhatsApp calls and such. And then, other sort of cloud-based work. We've seen people who've had, say, Fiverr or Upwork accounts, dormant accounts, but doing say graphic design as a regular job. When COVID hit, then switching onto the platform version of this work and sort of continuing. So, I mean, we also we've spoken to, in some of the research we've done, we've spoken to a couple of Sri Lankan online freelancing platforms, both focused women-centric, targeting women who want part-time, flexible, remote work. And both of these operate in this sort of hybrid zone, which was just spoken about, where they kind of straddle the gig and the sort of formal-ish, that line. And, both of them have told us there's been a huge demand for work from women for remote and flexible work in the last 2 years. And I mean, this, again, I mean, it's also part of a larger change that we've seen with, everyone switching to working from home, the changing perceptions and acceptance of remote work, which wasn't there before, even in the tech industry, in Sri Lanka. I think I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, I should really quickly, in just a couple of minutes, I think, you brought in the additional dimension of the impact of COVID specifically, and how that has influenced women's participation and engagement with the world of work. Some of it was actually being able to access platforms actually enabled women to continue to generate income despite COVID. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I mean, overall, do you think that the impact of COVID changing norms in terms of remote work, et cetera, actually promoted more women participating in the labor market post-COVID? Or do you see that, and how sticky do you think that would be? Do you think that these, of course, when we don't have data, so huge caveat, but I'm interested in your expert opinion on how do you think this is lasting change? Do you think, this will it's a temporary uptick? Can you elaborate a little bit on the post-COVID impacts of platformization on women's work?
So some of the survey data that Lanesha has gathered in India and Sri Lanka in, I think it was 2021, showed some of these shifts in terms of people obviously losing jobs and where do they go from there. So and this is, I would also say at the sort of beginning of the COVID, of the pandemic. So people who were losing jobs, we saw some shifts of men going into, listing themselves from being employed to being involved in unpaid care work. I mean, small numbers, but these were, little shifts that we saw. Whereas women who were previously, listing themselves as in unpaid care work or unpaid housework, moving to the category, to the sort of family business. Sorry, I forget the exact terminology, but basically focusing on home ventures. Again, I mean, as I said, small shifts, but then, we asked the question, what happened immediately as, COVID hit with the lockdowns? And then we also asked the question, okay, but now, 1.5 years into it, what's your status? So we did see some of these, I would say to a large extent, people shifting back to what they were originally doing. So less dads, doing the care work. So I'm not sure how lasting the overall changes will be, but I guess it also depends on, I mean, especially in Sri Lanka, for instance, we've only just had kids after 2 years of being at home, going back to school in a full, proper, sort of regular, I should say, way. It's been, they've been off for about 2 years. So that has a huge impact on women who are trying to do any form of work in the house. We spoke to, again, in the research, we were in Sri Lanka, we spoke to one home baker who she had a fairly, reasonable, not large, but she had a steady business, baking business before COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, she just, she couldn't manage it because she had a 4-year-old kid at home. And, just the demands that the online education required from parents was, so she just stopped her business. So we will have, cases like that. And maybe, a couple of years later down the line, we might see things picking up again. But specifically in Sri Lanka, because the economic situation is pretty bad at the moment, we might see people sort of looking into further opportunities even.
Great, thank you so much, Aisha. Dr. Tang, there's a question in the chat for you, which is, can you basically give us a breakdown? What is the percentage ratio of digital use of technology via social media and financial inclusion of women in Vietnam? What is the status of digital illiteracy of women? So kind of a general question asking whether you could kind of break down the extent to women leverage social media and their financial inclusion, and also sort of digital literacy and illiteracy among women in Vietnam. And to that, actually, since I'm just mindful of the time, if I could also add maybe just one or two, regulatory actions that the government is taking, just the key regulatory actions that the government might be taking to address women's engagement with digital platforms and women's work specifically.
Okay, Sabina, I have to be frank that I don't have these statistics, right? Because it's quite sophisticated, and I also doubt that in Vietnam we have such a statistics, right? Because gig economy actually emerging quite recently, and no, there are no official statistics except some small scale surveys, and but you see that that in Vietnam the process of digital transformation is accelerating very rapidly, so any figures can easily get outdated, right? So I think to be careful, I would not give you any figures. In terms of your second question, about kind of the how can I say, how to increase participation in the gig economy in particular, and in general, and the women participation in particular. I think that there are quite a number of interventions that both the private and public sector should do. The first one is that the gig economy was quite new in Vietnam. It just started to emerge roughly 3 or 5 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And the government of Vietnam actually was initially quite careful, and it had introduced a number of kind of sandboxes regarding things like Uber, in the transportation, and in a number of other areas. And there are issues of political economy. There's a fight between the traditional, how can I say, suppliers of the services and the new economy. So I think that there are still a lot of work that the government has to do in terms of improving the regulatory framework, and to ensure that there is to make sure to deal with the issue like I mentioned earlier about cybersecurity, misinformation, and other things, and to upgrade not only digital infrastructures, but also a kind of traditional connective infrastructures and logistics, and to even to improve access of people in general and women in particular to digital technologies, because during the pandemic time we witnessed the rise of digital divide, especially when kids had to stay at home, and many kids from poorer households cannot have a laptop or smartphone, and then therefore many women had to give them their smartphone or computer. So that is really a big issue. Of course, now kids are coming back to school. The problem may become less severe, but it's still there in terms of access to digital devices. And also, I think that it's quite important for the government to think about how to provide tax incentive to small traders on platforms. Nowadays, the government of Vietnam is actually quite very aggressive in terms of taxing transaction online, and including cross-border transactions, and digital taxes are being high in the government agenda, because the government wants to increase revenues for different types of public investment and public expenditures. But we think that there should be some kind of preferences treatment for small traders online, because these are largely women who actually sell on the internet. So there is a kind of some trade-off between raising government revenues and to ensure that women can participate more on the digital platforms as a source of their income generating activities. So of course, I think that we need more studies on both advantages and disadvantages of promoting this platform economy, and more analysis of the gender impact. So this is what I want to say. Thank you, Sabina. We cannot hear you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tang. And Kringsek, over to you now, with the same question about what are the different regulatory instruments that governments are adopting in order to ensure that, women have everything that they need, whether it's ancillary policies, better access to digital skills that Aisha was talking about. What is it that needs to be done to promote women's engagement in a more productive, well-remunerated, safer environment as this platform work unfolds?
Thank you, Sabina. I think my answer for this question will be really, really short. Because in Thailand, and I believe in other countries in the region as well, and perhaps around the world, in Thailand in particular, we have monitored the changing regulations, and we are actually really active in advocating for the reforms of the law, especially the labor law, that are quite outdated and are not keeping up to speed with the changing realities. And actually in Thailand, I think it's important to say that protecting gig workers, especially the domestic workers and massage therapists, has always been a challenge for the country. Especially domestic workers are still struggling and advocating for the change within this sector for the massage therapists, because of the changing nature of work that I mentioned. The Thai government has really struggled to understand and the complications or the complex nature of this work. And because the government has, I think instead of talking about what about the policy that we've seen, because there is non-existing right now, we could talk about obstacles. And one of the major obstacles that you already mentioned or alluded to is the conventional understanding of employee status, or the relationship between employers and employees, which are now changing because a lot of women in the care work, platform-based care work, they do not only work with one platforms anymore. They're working with multiple platforms, and inherently that because of the precarity that comes with the platform work. So they are forced to actually register with multiple platforms, and sometimes using their own social media accounts to be present online to seek out customers by themselves. I think one last thing that I would mention is that the government has been taking a lot of time to understand, and now when we talk about platform work, there's more progress that people think about food delivery workers. They understand better than 2 years ago about the situations and the challenges, but a lot of people are not thinking or do not really know about the invisible platform work, such as the care work that we study, and some of the changes that we see coming from the government is also, informed by the traditional understanding of what work is. And there is, for example, there is an attempt to pass a new law on informal workers. And I think that is, when we take a close look, we think that it's a wrong direction, because, there's a tendency that law, if passed, will kind of dismiss all of this platform-based workers and categorize them as informal, which is, I think, really, really controversial and problematic. Yeah.
Thank you, Kringsak. And Aisha, over to you to have the last word with respect to, what is on your wish list in terms of the regulatory changes that need to happen to govern these new emerging forms of work? What is the one thing that you would suggest in terms of a governance change, in terms of a regulatory change that could make a difference? So, Dr. Tang kind of singled out the example of taxation policies. Is there something similar that you think is pressing in terms of a regulatory agenda?
Svina, I think there are several things, unfortunately, but I guess in the interest of keeping this short, at the moment, Sri Lanka is still at the stage of the industry where the ecosystem needs to really be made more conducive for gig workers or platform-enabled workers in general. We're nowhere near the scale of countries like India, for instance. And I mean, yes, there is the whole series of changes to the labor law to update it to sort of make it applicable to people who are on flexible work and non-standard forms of employment. But I guess beyond that, I think it's important that, I guess I'll just say two things. One is, at the moment we don't have, it's the issue of payments specific to micro workers who are working, say, on international platforms. At the moment, we don't have gateways like PayPal working in Sri Lanka, so they find it difficult to really cash out their earnings. So they sort of resort to, various roundabout ways to get their money out of their accounts. And I mean, at a time when Sri Lanka is desperately in need of foreign exchange, I think that's something that needs kind of urgent attention. And the second thing is just a general recognition and formal recognition of gig workers and these kinds of people who are not earning in standard sort of, they're not getting pay slips, they're not getting regular salaries. A formal recognition in institutions like banks, even visa offices and stuff like that, because when you go to, say, take a loan from a bank, you're just not seen as someone who's making a regular living, so you're immediately sort of restricted in terms of opportunities to access other services. I think part of it is, earlier it was due to lack of understanding of this kind of work, but I think with the pandemic that's sort of getting a bit better, but it's, there's no real formal system to acknowledge that and provide services in that framework to these kinds of informal workers.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a very insightful discussion, and I'm not going to try in a very limited time to summarize the key points. What I will say is that what is interesting to me is both the uniformity of some of the challenges that confront women specifically as they engage in income generation, and particularly in online work, as well as some of the opportunities that platform work has to offer. And I think it's really instructive having discussions like this with experts across different countries, because we all, as I said before, this is an unprecedented, uncharted territory. And I think there's a lot to learn in terms of the impact that platformization is having on women's work, as well as the potential governance and regulatory agendas that must evolve in order to address this unfolding trend and harness its opportunities for women's work in general. So with that, my deepest thanks to Dr. Tang, to Dr. Kringsak, to Dr. Aisha. Thank you all so much for joining this conversation. And we hope to have you back and to continue, to think about this as the first in several discussions that we have an opportunity to engage with you on these issues. So thank you very much and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.